Well, our story starts today about 2 months ago. And a lot of you know I went on this long motorcycle trip up to Canada and other places. And so I'm a few days in. I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia. And so I've never been there before. I'm just exploring. And so it was a Saturday. I spent the day walking downtown. I probably walked, 10, 12 miles at this point. I've come back. I parked my motorcycle in this park called Stanley Park. Now, if you've never been there, this is one of the most famous parks in the world. I didn't know that until I got there. In 2014, it was rated the #1 park in the world. It's 1,000 acres. It is a natural rainforest. It is bordered by the Pacific Ocean. It is full of trails, beautiful trees, stunning beaches, sea walk, paths that go through it, wildlife all over the place. It is absolutely stunning. And so I'd walked through the whole sea walk into the city that day over to Granville Island. I'd come back. It's about 3:30. I'm getting tired. I'm walking through the park, just enjoying the beauty, and I see this bench. And this bench, just kind of perfect setting. Pond there, kind of ponds all through this thing. There's pond there. There are swans, there's geese, there's ducks, there's ducklings, there's birds. It is absolutely beautiful, surrounded by trees, dappled sunlight. 3:30, it's getting warm. I'm getting tired. And so I see this bench about 5 feet from the water, and it's just absolutely beautiful. I'm thinking, I need that bench. Like, that's my bench right there. But the problem is there's 4 other people in the area. There was 2 adults, 2 grown kids, and they're feeding a raccoon right in front of the water. Now, there are signs all through the park telling you, do not fill the wildlife. It's dangerous. One of the signs actually had this raccoon. And so I don't know if you know about raccoons, but I know this. They're really cute, but they are vicious, right? So I'm watching them feed this raccoon, and I'm like, are you from Canada or something? Like, don't you, what? Hey, don't you understand English? Speak French from Montreal? What is the problem here? And I'm kind of watching this, this is not looking good to me. And it's so beautiful, and it's so pastoral, and it's so stunning, but it's so dangerous, right? And so I'm watching this, and all of a sudden, it happens. Well, today we're going to continue this series that we've been in since the beginning of the year. For those of you who are brand new, this series is called Epic, and it's a study of a letter from a man, one of the leaders in the early movement of Jesus. His name was Paul, the Apostle Paul. He's writing to a group of Christ followers that are centered around the metropolitan area of a major city in the Roman Empire called Ephesus. Over 250,000 people there, capital of the province. And so he's writing to these Jesus followers, and he's sharing this epic vision that God has. He says, before time began, he said he has chosen you as followers of Jesus to be part of this vision, not only to be forgiven, not only to be adopted and be part of God's family, to play an important role in the restoration, recreation of all of the cosmos, both this life and the next life, to bring it under the authority of its true King, King Jesus. And so the first half of the letter, he's laying out this epic vision, and then the second half, he begins to get very practical and say, here's what it looks like to live out an epic vision as followers of Jesus in everyday life. And so we started a couple weeks ago in a new section that starts in chapter 5 and verse 21, and it goes through chapter 6 and verse 9. And in this section, he covers 3 really practical topics. He talks about marriage, what it looks like to follow Jesus in the area of marriage, what it looks like to live an epic life in the area of parenting, and then the third one is in the area of our workplace, how we approach our daily jobs. And so we spent a couple weeks on marriage. Today, the topic is parenting. And I want to say this is whether you currently have kids or not, whether you want to have kids, whether you have grandkids or foster kids or you've ever known a kid, that whatever your situation, I think this is one of those messages that's really for the whole body of Christ. Often you come, if you don't have kids, you're like, I'm parenting, what does that do with me? But the reality is that we are called to unleash a movement, and the reality is we are together in this thing. And though some of us have kids and some of us don't, or grandkids or don't, or foster kids don't, regardless that we're together in our life groups. We're together doing life together. And it's so important we understand kind of God's vision for our community here at Rocky Peak and what it means to come alongside of one another. Often the people who have the best insights to your parents don't have kids themselves. They're seeing it in your kids. And so whatever your state here, whether you currently have kids or not, it's a very important message for all of us. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to delve in. I'm calling this message Epic Parenting. And there in your note sheet, you have a section that's called Epic Parenting, the basic instructions. We're going to go over just 4 verses today. And so if you have your Bibles, you got your apps, let's go ahead and open up, turn them on. And it's going to go pretty quickly, and you're going to lay some really important groundwork. So he says, children, verse 1, 6:1, obey your parents in the Lord, as followers of Jesus now, for this is right. This is the right thing to do. We'll talk about that later, but God has structured human culture so the family is the core of kind of the basic building block, and he's kind of given parents as a leadership role. He's given kids a followership role, and so it's important if we're going to live life to the fullest that both parents and kids understand that. And so now Paul's going to back up this teaching from the Old Testament. In fact, he's going to quote from the 10 Commandments. Remember what Jesus said about the 10 Commandments. He said all the law in the Old Testament is just an explanation of what it means to love God or love people. And so the 5th commandment in the 10 Commandments is about families. And he's quoting from Deuteronomy chapter 5 here, and he says in verse 2, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment of the 10 Commandments, first commandment with a promise. Here's the promise, that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. So in other words, the commandments to kids, honor your parents, listen to them, because their job is to lead you in the path to life. If you follow them, you'll make wise choices. It'll lead to a long life instead of bad choices. It'll end your life early. That's kind of the thought. And so then he speaks to fathers, and interesting, notice that fathers, those of you who are dads here, he speaks directly to fathers as kind of leaders of the family. We'll talk about it later. And he says, hey, but in your role of leadership, don't exasperate your children. In other words, don't be unreasonable, don't be harsh, don't be frustrated or inconsistent as a leader. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So your job is to teach them how to follow Jesus and how to live this life that we're called to live so they can live an epic life in their life as well. So that's the passage, very simple. But what I want to do today is I want to start kind of break it down, and I want to start with one big picture principle that kind of is really important for us to understand about parenting. Then come back, I want to talk about 3 things that every kid needs to thrive. And then finally wrap up with 3 questions to see how we're doing. And so there in your note sheet, you have the section Epic Parenting, the big picture. And I just want to start with this kind of one big picture. I won't spend a lot of time here, but it's so important we catch it because we're often missing this in our culture today. And the big picture principle is that parents are leaders. That if you're a parent, if you aspire to be a parent, if you've been a parent, that God has called you to a leadership role in the life of your family. And this is very important because in our culture today, we've often lost sight of this. We are so afraid of messing up our kids, and I will talk about that multiple times today. We are so afraid that we're going to mess up our kids, we're going to do a poor job, then one day they're going to be on a therapist's couch blaming us and then sending us the bill. And as a result, we've backed off from this leadership role, and yet Paul wants us to understand. This is what I want you to catch in chapter 6 and verse 1. Look what he says. Children, he said, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is what? Right. In other words, this is the way God has designed life to work. You go back to the garden, he's chosen one man, one woman for a lifetime of love and commitment. We call that marriage. And he has chosen to bring children into the world through that sexual union, through that shared life, so that kids can grow up. And almost like in the animal kingdom, we see this all the time, right? Where the adult animals will raise their young. I love it the way like little ducklings will imprint from the parent, and they begin to follow them around and do whatever they do and model. And you see it even in the animal kingdom. This is kind of the design. And so as human beings at a much higher level, we are called that families were created that within that context of love and commitment from a mom and dad, these kids could grow up and learn the path of life. And it's our job as parents to lead them. And so in our culture, what I see today is we tend to kind of go to one extreme or the other in missing this. One extreme is we tend to become very passive. I think as a culture today, parents are very passive in leading their kids because we're not really sure what to do or how to lead. We don't want to put our values on them, mess them up. We want them to discover on their own. So we become very passive in our leadership. Or on the other side, we have become overly assertive. And so this passive side is the side you'll hear from the media, from education, psychology, and so on. On this other side, you'll see parents, and you see it sometimes out there, that are very aggressive, they're overly controlling, they're harsh, which is what Paul said not to do. And so these are the two extremes, and Paul says we're not to go to either extremes. Our job is to step in the middle, be strong leaders for our kids, direct them in the path to life. Okay, and so there's a leadership role there for parents, and as followers of Jesus, we want to embrace that role, understand how to pursue that role with excellence. Now, what I want to do next is I want to talk to you then, based on this passage, 3 things that every kid needs to thrive. And there on your note sheet, you have a section where I'm calling this the 3 essentials, epic parenting, the 3 essentials. And so let's jump in. Number 1, the first one doesn't flow directly out of this passage, but it flows out of Ephesians. We'll see this. The first thing that every kid needs, you have kids, it doesn't matter what age they are, doesn't matter, they need this. They need your affection. Now, you could say love, but I've chosen the word affection for reasons I'll explain later, right? Because the reality is your kids don't need you to love them, they need to feel your love. And that's why I've chosen the word affection. So the first thing they need is love. So as human beings, this is one of our basic needs, and it starts at home, that we need to know, every one of us needs to know that we are loved. And catch this, we're not loved for what we do. We're not loved based on our performance. We're loved based on who we are, that because of relationship. And it's sort of an unconditional love. Now, some of you growing up, you experienced that kind of love. Probably a lot of us here didn't experience that kind of love, but it's sort of a basic of our human personality. It's one of our basic needs. It's needing to be loved, and it just starts at home. Now, like I said, in Ephesians, the 6:1-4, Paul doesn't mention that, but here's the thing. I really believe he's assuming that. And I want you to think with me through the message of Ephesians, this whole epic vision that we've been talking about. This epic vision is that we were a lost race. We were a rebel race, but while we were rebelling against God, that God came after us. He loved us when we were his enemies. And then what did he do? He came after us. He not only chose us and forgave us, he adopted us. And why did he adopt us? So he could love us forever. In fact, when you get to chapter 5, after sharing this big vision, the first 3 chapters, in chapter 4, he starts getting practical. After laying out here's how to live out the vision in chapter 4, this is how Paul sums it up in 5:1. It's there in your note sheet. He says, so as followers of Jesus, he says, follow God's example, the way a young child would kind of imitate their parent. He says, imitate or follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved what? Children. Now catch those words. Paul says, this is who we are as followers of Jesus. This is the gospel in a nutshell. We have gotten to be enemies. We've gone from being enemies and rebels. We've come to be dearly loved children. You think of Jesus at his baptism. What does his father say to him? He says, you are my beloved son. And as followers of Jesus, this is what we've become. We've gone from enemies to being beloved children of God. That he just loves us to death, sings over us, rejoices over us, dreams for us. He loves us. And catch this, as our Father then, he becomes the model parent for all of us. And so the first thing our kids need, if they're going to grow and thrive, they need to know that they are loved, and not based on their performance, not based on their grades, not based on their behavior, not based on their achievement, all things that are important, but they are loved. Think of the prodigal, the father's son, had the worst son in the world, but when he comes home, what does the father runs to greet him, right? This father's love, he says that's where every kid needs to thrive. And that's these other 2 things that I'm going to give to you, they build on that. And without this first one, the next 2 won't be near as effective. Hey, the second thing that our kids need, that you see in this passage, is our kids need direction. You might choose the word instruction. So it starts with affection, then they need direction. Now, this is so important in our culture today, for those of you who are parents, because here's the thing. In our culture today, if you were to say, Do you think our culture gets the affection piece? I would say yes. I would say sometimes we've even gone overboard with this. Right? We're so afraid of hurting our kids' self-esteem that we'll never hold them to standards or quality, whatever. So not that it's always practiced, but I think in terms of a cultural message, the kids need to be loved. We get that. But the second one in our culture is really being challenged today. And what you see in our culture is, as parents, we are afraid to direct our kids because the message constantly out there is, well, I don't want to tell my kids what to believe. I don't want to tell my kids what their values should be. I want them to figure that out on their own. I want them to be their own person. I want to tell you, this is absolutely crazy. Because this is the equivalent of an eagle saying to the eaglet, it's time for you to fly, but I don't want to tell you how to do it. You need to figure this out. We're up here a couple thousand feet, so be careful. This is like a lion saying to the young, hey, you got to eat a lot every day. It's a lion. We're just telling you, we got to eat a lot. But I'm not going to tell you how to hunt. You need to figure that out because I want you to be your own lion someday, right? This is like yesterday I was out hiking. I saw 4 deer on the side of the mountain. I think it was 2 does and 2 fawns, so it's kind of unusual around here to see 4. This is like the doe saying to the fawn, hey, go out there, but be careful because there's a lot of danger. I don't want to tell you what it is, but if you see something that doesn't look so good, run for your life. It's like how crazy, right, that this is our design, that life is dangerous. The Bible teaches us all the way through. There is a path to life, there is a path to death. So choose wisely. Your life hangs, and for us just to put our kids out there and say, hey, figure this out. Hey, go listen to our culture, listen to your teachers, listen to the radio, listen to this, I'll take you to church, and then you kind of figure it out. That is crazy. Because life is dangerous. I mean, you see this in the animal kingdom. I started today with a story of me and at Stanley Park in Vancouver. You go back to that scene. I mean, it's just picture. It is beautiful, right? 3:30, breeze in the air, sunlight coming through, dappled sunlight, beautiful bench right there, 5 feet from the water. I want that bench. These people are there. They're feeding the raccoon. I think they're crazy. I'm waiting to see, are you going to get killed? And all of a sudden, that beautiful, serene, peaceful scene, it turns violent in a second. And that raccoon that was about 2 feet from the water, without any warning, he's eating from them, he flips around on a dime, takes 3 quick hops into the water, snags a duckling in its mouth, races back into the bushes, is gone. That mother duck flips around. She's not seen this. I think he was waiting until she was not looking. She flips around. She's got 5 ducklings left. She's looking. She's like counting 1, 2, 3, 4. She knows something's wrong. She is quacking like crazy. Geese are going off. Swans flying away. Birds are going crazy. It is utter chaos. In a second, it went from serenity to disaster. That's how life is. Life is dangerous. And that's why even in the animal kingdom, they are so intent on teaching their kid, here's how you do this, right? And so for us just to put our kids out there in the midst of this crazy culture and say, I hope you figure this out, I mean, it's like putting them in harm's way. Funny story, this nothing to do with anything. So they leave, right? The 4 people leave because their pet has now gone crazy. And so they leave like, whoa, like, I guess that's what the signs meant, So I'm happy now. They're gone. I got my bench. I've been waiting for this bench. And so I sit down on the bench, and I realize my feet are hot. I've been walking all day, and they're just really hot. So I take off my shoes. I take off my socks, and I start to read. I'm 5 minutes in. I'm getting sleepy. When I'm on these trips, I'm ready to go down at any moment. I'm always prepared. So I've got my bench there. I lay down. I pull out my eye shades from my backpack, carry them with me at all times, put on my eye shades, look like a homeless person, but who cares? It's Vancouver. No one knows it's Pastor Mike. So I lay down. I got my backpack, put it behind my head. I'm going down fast. I mean, 3 or 4 minutes, I'm about out. And all of a sudden, as my bare feet are there, I feel paws on my bare feet. The raccoon has come back. He is standing up on his back legs with his paws on my feet, looking at my toes. I have just watched this thing eat a huge duckling in one bite. Now it's my turn to move and show them how fast our race can move. Woo! Right. Anyway, point is, life is dangerous, right? And putting our kids out there, hey, figure it out, crazy. Now, when you turn to the Bible, one of the best books on parenting is the book of Proverbs. In fact, if I were you, and especially if I had young kids, I'm older kids too, but especially young kids, you're starting out, you're raising a family, hey, wed yourself to the book of Proverbs. It's got 31 chapters, 31 days in both months. You can read a chapter a day. Just put on this list, say, hey, okay, I'm going to read Proverbs. I'm going to ask myself the question, what do I learn about parenting? I'm going to read a chapter a day. It will revolutionize your life. Like the wisdom, best textbook in the world on parenting. Right? And so in Proverbs, in the opening chapters, there's so many, especially the first 8 or 9 chapters, so many of these father-son discussions on life. And when you get to chapter 3, I want you to see this. In chapter 3, it says, my son, this father is speaking to his son, he says, do not forget my teaching. And I want you to underline a word there or circle it. I want you to circle the word my. I want you to understand this as fathers especially, but fathers and mothers, I want you to understand that you have the primary responsibility to direct your children. That it's not the church's job. What the church does is incredibly important in the life of a child. But whether it's kids ministry or student ministry, it's incredibly important. But the most powerful influencer in the life of the child is their parent. And notice what this father says. He doesn't say, hey, listen to the rabbi's teaching. He says, listen to what? My teaching. He is instructing his son. And he says, listen to my teaching. And he said, keep my commands in your heart. Why? Because they'll prolong your life many years and they'll bring you prosperity. They'll lead you to life. And so you see this in Ephesians 6 and verse 4 too. Look at Ephesians 6:4. If you have your Bibles open, your apps open. What is the very first word in Ephesians 6:4? Let's try it again. Fathers. Yeah. Guys, we talked about this last week, that the leadership role God has called us to in our marriages. Remember what I said, that as men, it's our natural tendency to say, hey, I'll go make the money or whatever. It's kind of your job to watch over the marriage, let me know if anything's wrong, and your job to kind of raise the kids. Biblically, it's a father's responsibility to look over the leadership of his family. And so as dads, we need to be involved in this process. And obviously, moms are going to often have much more time. They're going to play an incredible key role. As king and queen, you're going to rule your kingdom, your kids together. But fathers take the lead. All right? So the second thing they're going to need is instruction or direction. And it's going to be in all areas of life. If you read Proverbs, it's not just spiritual instruction. It's like, it's financial instruction. It's sexual instruction. It's relational instruction. It moves to all different. It's kind of work ethic. All areas. Right. So as our kids, if they're going to grow health, every kid needs this. They need affection first, and they need direction second. Now, number 3, the third thing that they need is correction. So we have affection, we have direction, we have correction. Now, I want you to look at 6:4. The direction part is pretty clear. We just talked about that. 6:4, fathers, don't exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. So as parents, our job is to give that training and instruction, Lord, to bring them up. Of all the things we teach your kid, most important thing is spiritual life, their relationship with God, right? So that's pretty clear, the second point. But what's not as clear in the English translation is these two words, training and instruction, have a lot of overlap, semantic overlap, a lot of similarities. But they both have a sense not only of teaching, hey, here's the path to life, they both have a sense of correction or discipline or even warning to them. That part of our training is like a coach. You not only, hey, yeah, here's how to do it, but you discipline, like knock it off, sit on the bench, right? There's a sense of accountability that's built in. Now, this is one of the most important things we give to our kids is consistent discipline, consistent correction, consistent redirection. And it's so important because in our culture, of all the areas where we have backed off, this is the one most of all. I would say as a culture, we're big on affirmation. That's why every kid gets a student of the month, even if they're the worst kid in the world, right? Like, everyone gets a trophy of participation. You won, you participate. Like, we are so afraid of messing up our kid. Worst kid in the world, he'll get student of the month. It might be July during summer school when he's there for disciplinary review, but everyone's going to get it, right? So we're big on the affirmation. We're slower on the teaching. I don't want to put my values or on kids. I want to figure out that we're slower on that. But this is the worst area. We are really slow in the area of correction. And I think the reason is there's such a cultural confusion that's taken place since about the 1960s on the nature of kids and how they are. See, out there, the prevailing underlying theory of human behavior is, for most people in our culture today, and you don't often understand this, but there's a reason why these things they work out practically the way they do, is that there's a secular mindset out there, and basically the secular mindset goes like this, that human beings are basically good. And that so when a child goes bad, it's due to his environment. And so as a result of this, then there's tremendous pressure put on parents not to do anything bad that would cause your kid to go wrong. I remember back, it used to make my dad so mad. I can't remember back in the early 80s or somewhere, like way back. It was like, don't make a good kid go bad. It's an advertisement. Don't leave your keys in your car. Don't make a good kid go bad. Like, he was really a good kid. I left my keys in the car. He stole it. It's my fault. See, this is where our culture has gone. It's that kids are basically, so what that does then is it's put this fear in the heart of parents. We're afraid to do anything that could cause our kids to mess up. And so what's led is we become very passive as parents, not just on the teaching end, here's the path to life, but on the correction end. But the reality is, trust me, that if you want to raise healthy kids, one of the greatest gifts you give them is consistent, reasonable, appropriate discipline when they're off track. In fact, there in your note sheet, you see this in Proverbs chapter 6, where the father says to the son, he says, these commands I give to you, they're a lamp, and this teaching is a light. In other words, you live in a dark world as a kid, you don't know. It's like darkness. And he says, the teaching, the commands I'm giving, are like a flashlight in a dark night, like showing you the path to life. Okay, so that's the role that, number 2, direction plays. But look what he says next. He says, and the corrections of discipline are the way to life. Did you catch that? The corrections of discipline are the way to life. Later on in Proverbs, it says, if you hate your kid, don't discipline them. The correction of discipline is the way to life. So one of our roles as parents is not just to direct them in the path, but to redirect them. And what you see in Proverbs is that often, not always, but often, in order to redirect our kids in the path of life, it will require pain. It's the power of pain. In other words, if you want to change a kid's behavior, change your directions, you're going to have to bring pain to bear. In Proverbs, it often describes this as the rod of correction. Now, I know this is sort of controversial. We've kind of come to a day and age where it's not politically correct to spank. I want to tell you that I am a big proponent of appropriate corporal punishment. You don't have to agree with that. I think the Bible teaches it, but I understand if you don't believe. But here's whether you agree with that or not, here's what you need to understand. that whatever discipline we bring in our kids' life, it has to be painful enough to produce change. If it doesn't, it's not discipline. And so whether you choose spanking in certain situations, you choose timeouts, you choose natural consequences, whatever you choose, Proverbs is really big that usually to redirect a child's disobedience requires pain. And here's what we're trying to achieve when we're disciplining our kids. And I want you to catch this. Often we miss this. The ultimate goal of discipline is self-discipline. When you're raising your kids and you're disciplining them, you're saying, what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to achieve self-discipline. See, in Proverbs it says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. They're not all good. We're not born that way. We're fallen people. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline drives it out. And so what happens, the goal of discipline then is self-discipline. So here's what happens. When you have a child here and they have wrong attitudes, or they have wrong actions, and they're on the wrong path in a particular situation, that what discipline is about bringing external pain into their life that would give them the motivation to change and make right choices. And catch this, it's one of the greatest gifts you can give to your kids. Because when you do that consistently, you know what the child learns? The child learns this: I do not have to be a slave to my emotions. I can want something and give it up. They learn that they have that capacity. Now, the way they're learning it is because you're bringing pain in their life if they don't. But they're learning the power of self-control. They're learning impulse. They're learning that I can really want that toy, but I don't have to throw a tantrum. I have that capacity to control that emotions. Right? By your discipline, you're teaching them they have the power to choose. And can I tell you something? The ability to say no to yourself is one of the most important lessons in life for success at any level. Years ago, back in the 1990s, I still remember walking in Santa Barbara. Lynn and I were away for a week. Walking in Santa Barbara, walking by a bookstore, and saw a brand new book out that was destined to become part of the language of our culture. It was the book it was called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. And in that book, he said that that the secret to life, or the premise of the book, was if you want to be successful to life, the key is not your IQ. It's your EQ, your emotional intelligence. And he went on to highlight what he believed were 5 core elements of emotional intelligence. And one of them was self-control, impulse control, the ability to say no to yourself. And he cited all kinds of fascinating studies and long-term studies of kids and how they tested this over time. It's kind of what Proverbs has told us all along. But there in your note sheet, I put a quote from his book. And he says, there is perhaps no psychological skill more fundamental than resisting impulse. Catch this, it is the root of all emotional self-control. Those who are at the mercy of impulse, who lack self-control, catch this, not a Christian book, suffer a moral deficiency. The ability to control impulse is at the base of will and character. All right, so 3 things every kid needs to succeed from their parent. Number 1, affection. Number 2, direction. Number 3, correction. Now, we want to do some self-evaluation here. For some of you, this will be, you've got parents, you got kids at home, you got older kids, you have grandkids, you'll be there. For some of you, maybe not. You're going to be called upon, people in your life group coming to you, help me for wisdom with this. So I want to do some self-evaluation here. Epic parenting, 3 questions. And so I'm going to give you kind of 3 questions. They're going to correspond to the 3 needs. First question is, do your kids know that you love them? Now notice, I did not ask, do you love your kids? Chances are you do. Yeah, I'm not assuming. But chances are you love your kids. And if I were to say, do you think your kids know that you love them? You'd say, well, of course they do. And you probably begin to tell me, okay, look, I drive the 405 every day. Why else would I do that? I mean, I love my kids. I'm going to work. You might say, of course, I drive them around. I buy them stuff. I take them out to movies. I wash their clothes. I make their meal. Of course, I love them. Right? And catch this, you may be absolutely right. Your kids may know that you love them deeply and you cherish them apart from their performance. It's not a conditional love. You really love them and they feel very loved. So you may be absolutely right. But what I challenge you with is it's very possible to love your kids and for them not to feel loved. And one of the reasons is because often as human beings, we receive love in different ways. Like Gary Chapman's written a lot of books on this, on love languages. In fact, there's one there on your note sheet. It says by Gary Smalley. It's really by Gary Chapman. So I want to give the credit where credit's due. But anyway, for example, you can be married to someone and you can be, in your mind, really showing lots of love to your spouse, but they're not feeling loved because you're not speaking their language. Same can happen with our kids. So there's different ways we receive love, right? So for some of us, it's touch, it's hugging, it's snuggling. That's how we feel love. For others of us, it's shared activities, time together. For others, it's deep conversation. For others, it's gifts. Now there's different languages of love. And so with your kids, certain kids speak different languages. And I would ask you, when you were growing up, or maybe ask you now, if you were to look back on your parents, do you believe your parents loved you? And my guess would be that probably many of you here would say, yes, they loved me. And then if I ask you a second question, did you feel loved as you were growing up? And maybe a very different question. Because now as an adult, you can look back and know, hey, your dad never said, I love you. He never expressed that in words. But now looking back, you can see, well, he really did. You can say, well, my family wasn't very affectionate, so I didn't really feel love at the time, but now you see they did. So as adults, we can look back, but when you're a kid, you can't always put those things together. All you know is, do you feel loved? Do you feel cherished? Do you feel treasured? Or do you not? And so the question I'm asking is not, do you love your kids? I'm asking, do they feel loved? And only you can answer that. Only they can answer that. And so I encourage you, if this is an area you're like, I'm not really sure, I want to learn more, there's a book by Gary Chapman, not Gary Smalley, on your note sheet, that you can check that out, The 5 Love Languages of Children. Number 2, that one we're going to go faster on because I think it's easier to catch. Number 2 is, how intentional is your instruction? So we saw today that one of the things our kids need most is direction, they need instruction. And so the question is, how intentional is your instruction? And so catch this, in Proverbs it's so clear that as we raise kids that all of life is under the leadership of King Jesus, and so we're to teach them in all areas. We're to teach them about finances, about sexuality, about work ethic, about relationships, about laziness, all kinds of things. We're to raise our kids and to direct them in all the paths of life. But I want you to catch this. Of all the areas, as followers of Jesus, the most important area that we are intentional about instructing our kids is in their spiritual life. Because nothing matters more than that your kids grow up to love and know and pursue God. Remember what Jesus said. What does it profit a person to gain the whole world and lose their soul? Right? And so what does it matter if our kids grow up and they're very successful and get good careers and big houses and big salaries, and yet spiritually they reject Christ? Right? So this is why in Ephesians 6:4 we read today that we're to bring up our kids in the training and instruction, of the Lord. Most important thing. And so what I want to ask is, as parents, as grandparents, as foster parents, how intentional are you being in providing that instruction that will help them to thrive spiritually? Now, to get at this, I'm going to ask 3 sub-questions of point number 2, or question number 2. They're not on your note sheet, so you have to write them in. but it's just kind of messy for me to write them all in. And so I'm going to run that. And so I want to challenge you in this intentionality. I want to just drill down and say, okay, can we be more practical? Can we put the cookies on the bottom shelf a little lower within reach? Is there a way to kind of analyze how we're doing? And so 3 questions I think would be helpful. Number 1 is, how important is their spiritual life to you? Their spiritual life, their relationship with Jesus, how important is their spiritual life to you? And part of that question is, then do your choices and your priorities reflect that? Here's what I find, and my hunch is I may step on some toes today, and I just want you to know that that's not really my point. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad. I'm just trying to go back to the basics, ask some really tough questions to help you raise your kids well. So down the road, there's not regret that you've said, hey, I did everything I could to raise them in the faith, right? And so I know this is going to get a little dicey here, but I just want you to know I'm not angry, I'm not mad. I'm just trying to be helpful, right? But some of you are going to get very nervous. All right, so here's what I've seen, even in Christian circles, is that often if I were to ask you, how high a priority is it that your children would walk with God? That for most of us, it's a really high priority. But here's what I've often seen. Our life and our choices don't bear that out. And here's what I've seen in Christian families that Christians they will move heaven and earth to help their children get better grades. They'll hire a tutor, they'll work with them personally, they'll nag at them, they'll inspire them, they'll pay them, they'll bribe, high value, right? We will move heaven and earth to drive our kids all over the city to sporting events. We will work an extra job, we will sacrifice so we have the money to get karate lessons or band lessons or dance lessons or whatever it is. Tremendous sacrifice, intentionality in these areas. But when it comes to their spiritual life, many times we will not make it a priority for them to be at church, in kids ministry or student ministry on the weekends. Because it's club volleyball, it's football, it's baseball, it's soccer. We can't, we want to be there, it's a value, but that we will, on a Wednesday night when the wildlife is meeting, the middle school is meeting, or when our high school small groups are meeting, that we will encourage our kid to stay home and miss their small group because they have a big test tomorrow and they need to study. When it comes time to summer camp or winter camp, which are so life-changing in the life of students, we'll say, I can't afford that, it's just too expensive. While all year long we've been paying big bucks for other things. And men and women, we've got to just get honest about this real. But you know what we're saying in that? What we're saying is we want you to follow Jesus, but the reality is, as parents, our highest value is not Jesus or spiritual life. Our highest value is that you get good grades, a good education, you get a scholarship to college, you're popular at school. That's what's important. And then what happens is when our kids graduate and they go to college and they give up the faith, and we come and go, well, what happened? We raised them well. You haven't raised them well. What you have done is you've said, Jesus is important if you can fit him into your busy schedule. What's important is you make the team. What's important is your grades. What's important is scholarship. What's important is career. All their life, we've been sending them the wrong message with the right words. And so for your life, how important really is their spiritual life? Second question. These don't get easier, by the way. Number 2. Are you growing in your own life? I mentioned this earlier, but parents, we often underestimate that the most powerful influence and tool you have in your kid's life is you. And not what you say your values are, it's who you are. Like if you're pursuing God with a full heart, if your number one passion in life is to know him and to please him and to serve him, and you're making choices out of that value base and how you spend your time, and your kids see you spending time with God 101, and they see how important church is and using your gifts are, and they see you giving generously to the kingdom, can I tell you something? That is amazing influence in your kid's life. because you're model. This is what it looks like to pursue Jesus. And when you have tough integrity choices, men, when you're loving your wives, when you're loving your husbands, when you're helping the poor, when we're living this life, that is the most powerful influencer you have. When you say, hey, Jesus is important, but you're not living out those values in your life, you are also sending a message. You see, spiritual values are more caught than taught. So your kids are watching. And can I tell you something? They are brilliant. They are so smart when it comes to, they have such a nose for what's really true. Hey, if you serve other gods other than the Lord God in your life, if there are other gods in your life that are more important, let me tell you, your kids know it. And so, are you growing? Are you pursuing? Are you using your gifts? Are you in small group? Hey, if you want your kids to grow up and be involved in church and building a relationship, if you want your kids, and they grow up, you say, you want your kids in a life group and plugged in, then you better be in what? Because you are laying a foundation and a model. And long after other things have passed, it's your model that impacts the most. Number 3, third question under number 2. Are you making the most of teachable moments? You know, earlier today we talked about Deuteronomy 5, the 10 Commandments, and Paul quotes it in Ephesians 6. And he quotes Deuteronomy 5 and honor your father and mother. And so in the very next chapter comes perhaps one of the most important verses in all the Old Testament. It's a verse that was later on quoted by Jewish men every morning when they get up. It was used every week in the synagogue. It's called the Shema, and it's a very famous verse, and you'll recognize it, most of you, because Jesus quotes it. Jesus was once asked, of all the laws in the Old Testament, what's the most important? He quoted this verse. It's from Deuteronomy 6. So Moses is telling the nation of Israel, as you go in the promised land, here's what it's going to take to succeed. And he starts here with this verse. It's there in your note sheet. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord, Yahweh, all caps, the Lord Yahweh, our God, the Lord is one." So here's the thing. Number 1 priority, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your strength. And Jesus asked, what's most important? He said, hey, most important thing in life is love God passionately. All your heart, all your soul, all your strength. Number 1, that's where life starts from. Do that, you're on the right track. But what's so interesting is what comes next in Deuteronomy 6, the very next verse. And it's there in your note sheet. It says, these commandments that I give you today, you're loving God, all your heart and all, are to be on your hearts. Catch that. He says, this is not like a mental thing, not a religious thing. This is going to be your passion. It's on your hearts. And he says, so once it's on your hearts, impress them on your what? Children. Impress them on your children. And he says, talk about then when you sit at home and when you walk along the road or drive in the car. When you lie down and when you get up, which is a Hebrew way of saying all the time. It's a Hebrew of saying, when you're inside, when you're outside, when you get up, when you go to bed. It's a Hebrew way of saying all the time. And so what Moses is saying is don't think of your training, your teaching your kids as something that just happens at formal times. He says what you need to do is just share your life with your kids. And as a follower of Jesus, you love Jesus. He's Lord over all life. And so there's opportunities all the time about why we don't do that entertainment, or why we give this to the kingdom of God, or why we serve here, or why it's important how we choose friends, or why it goes on and on. And there's times, all the time, opportunities. And so Moses says, hey, he says, as you go in the promised land, here's the key. Number 1, you've got to love God with all your heart. You can't impress on your kids what you don't have. That's what we just talked about. It starts there, pursuing God with your heart. I mean, once you do that, he says, look for teachable moments in the life of your child. Don't be one of those Christians. There's a church life, and then there's real life. No, as Christians, we have a unified life because Jesus is king over every area. He's king over our finances. He's king over our sexuality. He's king over our relationships. He's king over our work life. We'll talk about that next week. And so as a Christian, we're learning how to follow Jesus, moving this epic life He's called us to live in every area. And He says, as your kids are there and they ask questions, there's opportunities, share with them in small bits. Share with them, this is why we do what we do. You see? Are you making the most of intentional moments? All right, so on this one, if you say, hey, I think I want to grow in this area, I want to recommend a book. This is a book, honestly, I haven't read, but it's a book that our youth ministry and our family ministries highly recommend. It's called Spiritual Parenting. And so it's there on your note sheet. Now, number 3. The third question is, how effective is your discipline? We've seen today that one of the greatest gifts we can give to our kids is discipline, because it allows them to become self-disciplined so that when they get older, like when my kids were in high school, right? When my daughter was in high school, I remember sitting down with her and I said, you know what? We're going into some new territory here. And I know that there's just between parents and kids during adolescent years, there's this natural war between control, right? Kids want to make their own decisions. You want to make their own decisions. You want to make them kind of keep on in control. And I said, I know that's, I said, so I want you to know this, that my goal is for you to have as much freedom as possible as soon as possible. That we share the same goal. Like you don't want anyone telling you to do, I don't want anyone telling you to do. My goal is to give you as much freedom as soon as possible. I said, so here's what's going to happen. As you show wisdom in your choices, I will give you more freedom. And as long as you continue in growing that wisdom, you'll get more and more freedom. Now, I remember when my youngest daughter was a senior in high school, her boyfriend came and said, I want for the prom, I want to fly her to Las Vegas. We're going to have dinner at the Venetian and fly back for the prom. And I said, I had some questions, practical questions. I said, sounds great to me. All my friends are like, are you crazy? It's like, no. Shown great wisdom. This is my goal in life. My goal is to set her free. My goal is to give her as much freedom as possible. They went, they had a fantastic time, great experience, but she had shown wisdom all the way through. You see? So our goal is to set our kids free. That's our goal. And then hope they don't come home. No, just kidding. All right, so the question is, how effective is your discipline? And you say, well, how do I know? And the question is, when you discipline your children, does it redirect their behavior? Does it work? Like, discipline is not yelling at your kids for a half an hour. That's not discipline. That's wearing yourself out. That's frustrating yourself. Discipline is bringing pain to bear on the situation in such a way it changes behavior. Right? So, for example, let me just give you a practical. I wish I had more time for this, but let me just give you a practical. When you ask your kids to do something, do they do it? How many times do you have to ask them? Then you see parents, I'm going to count to 10. I'm like, why? What's going to happen at 10 that can't happen at 1? We've just wasted 9 seconds of our life. You do that every day for 15 years, you've lost about 10 years off your life, right? Right, so what's going to happen at 10 that doesn't happen at 1? See? So when you ask your kids to do something, do they do it or not? As a general rule, I realize some kids are more strong-willed. I understand that. You have to work harder with certain horses to break them, right? The stallions, right? The ones who are going to be the great war horses, right? And so, I get that. But when you ask your kid to do something, do they do it? As a general rule, do they do it? How many times do you have to ask them? How much do you have to threaten, beg, whatever? I'm telling you, one of the things I feel saddest about sometimes, I'll see like in a grocery store, we've all been there, right? You see in a grocery store, and some kid is 3 years old holding their parent hostage. Because they wanted something, the parent said no, he's having a meltdown, tantrum. And so now the parent is like pleading, begging, promising, bribing, threatening. And the kid's is there, 3 years old, he's got the parent wrapped around their finger. Because that kid's already learned that nothing is ever going to happen. My parent's weak. My parents got no nerve. I'm stronger than they are. And so let them get upset. Fine with me. I'm going to get what I want. I'll leave with the toy, and we're going to be good. Right? This kid's going to end up being a sociopath, run the world, but... See, what happens is that kids test you, and they want to know if you're serious about this. And when you bring pain to bear, one of the most important lessons every kid needs to learn is you don't mess with mom and dad. Because if you do, there are consequences. They're reasonable, they're consistent, they're not abusive, but there are consequences and they're painful. So we don't want to break the spirit of our kids, but we have to break the will. They have to learn how to obey. Why? Because it's right, and it's a key to a long life. And if they don't learn how to obey you, it's going to be hard to learn how to obey anyone else in life, and ultimately it's going to be hard to learn to obey God. You see? And so your kids, do they know, is it effective? Is the discipline effective? All right. So there on your note sheet, there's a verse from Proverbs. The rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a child left to himself disgraces his mother. Both sides of that are true. Rod of correction imparts wisdom, life wisdom. Left to himself brings disgrace. And so you say, you know what, I'm not sure I have a handle on that one, or I need to grow. The book I'd recommend, kind of tested, tried, standard. It's got a new version out called The New Dare to Discipline. James Dobson, great advice on that, all right? And so let's wrap it up. Big picture. We don't miss the big picture. You and I are called to live epic lives as followers of Jesus. One of our top priorities, if we have kids, our top priority is to help them become the people they're meant to be, to thrive, and so they can experience epic lives. That requires affection, it requires direction, it requires correction. Right? And as we apply that under God's leadership in our life, our kids can grow and thrive, and the movement continues. Amen? Let's pray.